This is Tennyson at a long glance, and I'm Charlie McDermitt. Alfred Tennyson was a poet from Victorian England who was one of the best poets of his era. He was, if not the best, the most Victorian of the Victorian poets. He wrote, among other poems, Ulysses, Tears, Idle Tears, The Idylls of the King, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and In Memoriam. In this video, we're only going to talk about those last two. The Lord in Alfred Lord Tennyson is not part of his name. His name was Alfred Tennyson, but he received the title Lord when he was made a peer late in his life. Now, on to the first poem. The Charge of the Light Brigade is a fictionalized version of an actual historical charge at the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War. Tennyson wrote it as part of his duties as England's poet laureate, which is and was a largely ceremonial position. Tennyson did write many poems about current events while he was poet laureate, which he called newspaper poems. They were taken straight from the newspapers, and they told a story, much like newspapers do. Almost all of them are pretty much forgotten now. For example, Tennyson wrote a poem about the Charge of the Heavy Brigade at the same battle as the Light Brigade that no one remembers now, but the Charge of the Light Brigade is still remembered and is probably Tennyson's best-known poem. Before we get started reading that, let's talk a little bit about meter. Meter is the technical term for the pattern of rhythm in a poem. It's described by the type and number of feet, which are small groups of syllables with a set pattern of emphasis on each line. For example, an I am, one of the simplest feet, has the pattern bum-bum, one unstressed syllable, and then a stressed one. It's the same rhythm you hear in words like to go or baton. So a line of poetry that uses iambs would be called iambic. The second word in the description of meter is the number of feet in the line, phrased as whatever meter. Dimeter is 2 feet per line, trimeter is 3 feet, tetrameter is 4, pentameter is 5, and hexameter is 6. The Charge of the Light Brigade is written in dactylic dimeter, which gives it a pretty unusual rhythm. A dactyl is a foot with a bump-bum stress, so a line of dactylic dimeter with 2 feet per line has a pattern of bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. The meter calls to mind horse hooves, which is appropriate because the poem is about a cavalry charge. Listen. Bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. For an example, listen to Tennyson reading part of the first stanza of Charge of the Light Brigade. Unfortunately, the recording isn't very good, but it's still nice to hear Tennyson's voice. Now, let's start reading on our own. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed out with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Now it's time for a bit more historical context. The actual Charge of the Light Brigade was an ill-fated attack by a British light cavalry brigade on a very strongly defended Russian position during the Crimean War. The brigade's orders were mixed up, meaning that instead of being sent somewhere relatively safe, they were told to charge directly down what Tennyson calls the Valley of Death, with Russian cannon surrounding them on 3 sides. You can see the valley here with gun smoke on 3 sides of the brigade and dead men and horses scattered all through the valley. This is a large group of men riding horses directly at and past a bunch of other guys who are trying to shoot at them with cannons. Tennyson called it the jaws of death for a reason. When he says someone blundered, that's a huge understatement, as his readers would have known. They would have read the same newspaper accounts that he used to write the poem. You can also see more of how the meter in the poem works here. The short lines and few stresses rush the poem along. Tennyson also heavily uses a technique called enjambment, which is what happens when you split a sentence between 2 lines of poetry. This creates a slight pause in the middle of the sentence when you stop to move to the next line, but also pushes you forward because you know more of the sentence is coming. It's very visible in the 2 repeated lines. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Note the lack of punctuation there. Both lines are one complete thought that's only interrupted by the line break. Tennyson also messes with the pattern of dactylic dimeter in the second stanza. You might have noticed that most of the poem alternates between having one more and one less syllable than true dactylic dimeter, and that's perfectly fine. It's just a pattern. It's okay to diverge from that and even call it the same thing. Extra unstressed syllables at the end of lines are especially common. However, Tennyson also diverges from the pattern that he set up in probably the most famous lines of the poem. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and to die. Instead of being the bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum of the rest of the poem, these three lines have an extra stressed syllable at the end. They go bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. The extra stress makes them stand out from the rest of the poem, which could be part of why they're so well known. The phrase Valley of Death also creates this effect when it's placed at the end of the line. Now, because doing this makes a line stand out, if you see a poet change the pattern this way, there's a good chance they're trying to get you to look at something important. We've already talked about how deadly the Valley of Death was, but the there's nots are an even better example, because these three lines are how Tennyson starts to lionize the soldiers in the Light Brigade. Everyone in England knew that someone screwed up and sent the Light Brigade on a hopeless mission, but Tennyson presents soldiers as being heroic because they were brave and did what they were ordered to despite the fact that they knew it was hopeless. We'll see more of that when we keep reading. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell, they that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! Oh, the world wondered. Honor the charge they made, honor the Light Brigade, noble 600. The Light Brigade did reach the guns they were mistakenly ordered to attack. They were forced to retreat again before long. As a result, they charged at the guns, were shot at, and made it to the guns, but then they were chased off, and the men who were left had to go back the way they came while being shot at more. The Light Brigade was actually 700 men, not 600, but almost 300 of them were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. In an attempt to salvage whatever he can from that mess, Tennyson presents them as glorious and honorable. In the last stanza, he directly asks the reader to honor the Light Brigade's charge. He doesn't seem to be entirely pro-war, though, because the poem is still very much about the blunder and its awful results. While he's praising them, he slips in a line about how all the world wondered why they charged. Even though poems about national events were what Tennyson wrote as poet laureate, he initially published the poem with only his initials, A.T. Stephanie Markovitz suggests that this may have been because he was unable to be as unashamedly patriotic as usual in this poem. Another of Tennyson's best-known poems is In Memoriam, which is most likely his greatest work. It's a massive poem, and even just reading it out loud would take hours, so unfortunately it's not possible to properly cover In Memoriam in the time we have. As a result, we're going to go through what I'm calling the In Memoriam highlight reel instead. Like an actual highlight reel, it's not as good as watching or reading the whole thing, but you can get an idea of what happens and hopefully catch up on the rest later. Tennyson wrote In Memoriam after the death of Arthur Henry Hallam. The full title of the poem is actually In Memoriam A.H.H. Tennyson met Hallam at Cambridge, where they were both members of a group called the Apostles. They became extremely close friends, and Hallam got engaged to Tennyson's sister, but then he died when he was only 22. Tennyson was rather upset, to say the least, which we'll see in a minute. Over the next 17 years, he wrote short poems about how he felt and eventually combined them into In Memoriam. There are 131 sections, plus a preface and epilogue. Most of them are pretty short, probably averaging about 5 4-line stanzas each, but of course some are longer. The sections are semi-independent of each other. Each section is one individual thought in the chain that runs through the poem. They don't usually come directly from each other, but they are all related. Two titles Tennyson originally considered, which can help show the relationship between the sections, were Fragments of an Elegy and The Way of the Soul. Each section of the poem can be seen as a fragment of a larger elegy, which is a poem about death, grief, and loss. Elegies are usually written about a specific person who died, as In Memoriam is. The sections come together to illustrate Tennyson's personal experience and how his soul changes as he mourns his friend. Let's start reading. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Thine are these orbs of light and shade, thou madest life in man and brute, Thou madest death, and lo, thy foot is on the skull which thou hast made. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust. Thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him. Thou art just. Thou seemest human and divine, the highest, holiest manhood, thou. Our wills are ours, we know not how. Our wills are ours to make them thine. Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. We have but faith, we cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, and yet we trust it comes from thee, a beam in darkness, let it grow. Let knowledge grow from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell, that mind and soul, according well, may make one music as before. But vaster, we are fools and slight, we mock thee when we do not fear. But help thy foolish ones to bear, help thy vain worlds to bear thy light. Forgive what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began, for merit lives from man to man, and not from man, O Lord, to thee. Forgive my grief for one removed, thy creature whom I found so fair. I trust he lives in thee, and there I found him worthier to be loved. Forgive these wild and wandering cries, confusions of a wasted youth. Forgive them where they fail in truth, and in thy wisdom make me wise. The first section of the poem, the prologue, was written after the rest of the poem. Here, Tennyson has already gone through the religious journey in the rest of the poem and looks back at his initial wild and wandering cries from his new, more complete perspective. Remember, the poem wasn't published until 17 years after Hallam died. The prologue takes the form of a prayer, where Tennyson praises God by describing to him and the reader what Tennyson learned while writing the poem. He talks about how we embrace God by faith even though we have no proof, how God made us and will take care of us, and how faith works with our natural knowledge but takes precedence over it. He then asks for forgiveness for his previous perceived failings, distancing himself from the beginning of the poem. You probably noticed that In Memoriam uses different stanzas and rhythm than the Charge of the Light Brigade. Get used to it because it stays the same through all 131 sections. In Memoriam is entirely written in 4-line stanzas of iambic tetrameter, which means 4 repetitions of the bum-bum pattern called an iamb. Each line has a bum-bum, 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 bum-bum pattern. The stanzas also all share an ABBA rhyme scheme, which means that the first line of each stanza rhymes with the last line, and the 2 middle lines rhyme. Let's read some more from section 7. Dark house, by which once more I stand, here in the long unlovely street, doors, where my heart was used to beat so quickly, waiting for a hand that can be clasped no more. Behold me, for I cannot sleep, and like a guilty thing I creep at earliest morning to the door. He is not here, but far away the noise of life begins again, and ghastly through the drizzling rain on the bald street breaks the blank day. Now we're back to the beginning, just after Hallam died, and Tennyson is talking about how much he misses him. It's very early in the morning, since the sun rises at the end of the section, and Tennyson is visiting the dark house where Hallam used to be because he can't sleep. Tennyson speaks directly to the house and its doors, using apostrophe, which basically means to directly address something in the poem other than the audience. The prayer at the beginning of the poem, where Tennyson addresses the strong Son of God, and the dark house by which once more I stand in section 7 are both examples. According to W. David Shaw, this use of apostrophe attaches the house and doors to the rest of the poem, but the lack of grammar shows how the speaker's world is falling apart and helps to separate Hallam from it. For example, the first 2 stanzas of that section are one really long sentence, and the last stanza uses unusual word order. Let's go to section 28. The time draws near the birth of Christ, the moon is hid, the night is still, the Christmas bells from hill to hill answer each other in the mist. 4 voices of 4 hamlets round, from far and near on mead and moor, swell out and fail, as if a door were shut between me and the sound. Each voice 4 changes on the wind, that now dilate and now decrease. Peace and goodwill and peace and goodwill to all mankind. This year I slept and woke with pain. I almost wished no more to wake, and that my hold on life would break before I heard those bells again. But they my troubled spirit rule, for they controlled me when a boy. They bring me sorrow touched with joy, the merry, merry bells of Yule. 3 Christmases appear in the poem, which gives us a reference point to watch Tennyson as he changes. As you can see, he's still sad here despite the seasons, saying he almost wishes he'd just die instead of going on feeling miserable. Remember this section so you can compare it to the 2 other Christmases later. Let's read section 55. The wish that of the living whole no life may fail beyond the grave, derives it not from what we have the likest God within the soul? Are God and nature then at strife, that nature lends such evil dreams? So careful of the type she seems, so careless of the single life, that I, considering everywhere her secret meaning in her deeds, and finding that of 50 seeds she often brings but one to bear, I falter where I firmly trod, and falling with my weight of cares upon the great world's altar stairs that slope through darkness up to God, I stretch lame hands of faith, and grope, and gather dust and chaff, and call to what I feel is Lord of all, and faintly trust the larger hope. When Tennyson says type here, he's talking about biological type. He's saying nature is careful to protect an entire species, but doesn't care about individuals. This is one theme that goes through much of the poem, not just this section. The next section is a continuation of this one. When Tennyson sees the odds against him, he can only pray and hope that God will hear him. T.S. Eliot famously said that In Memoriam is not religious because of the quality of its faith, but because of the quality of its doubt. The doubt really shows through here. Tennyson stretches his lame hands that can only offer dust and chaff, worthless waste as a sacrifice. He doesn't even know what he's praying to. He's just calling to what he feels is in charge and hoping he's right. Let's go to Next Christmas. Again at Christmas did we weave the holly round the Christmas hearth. The silent snow possessed the earth, and calmly fell our Christmas Eve. The Yule clog sparkled keen with frost, no wing of wind the region swept, but over all things brooding slept the quiet sense of something lost. As in the winters left behind, again our ancient games had place, the mimic pictures breathing grace, and dance and song and hoodman blind. Who showed a token of distress? No single tear, no mark of pain. O sorrow, then can sorrow wane? O grief, can grief be changed to less? O last regret, regret can die. No, next with all this mystic frame, her deep relations are the same, but with long use her tears are dry. Now, instead of suicidal grief, Tennyson's moved on to a quiet sense of something lost. He still misses Helen, as he said, her deep relations are the same, but he's somewhat accepted it and at least has stopped crying, even if that's only through running out of tears. Remember that we're necessarily leaving a lot of the poem out. This healing is a really slow process, but we're fast-forwarding through it. Next section. By night we lingered on the lawn, for underfoot the herb was dry, and genial warmth, and o'er the sky the silvery haze of summer drawn, and calm that let the tapers burn unwavering, not a cricket chirred, the brook alone far off was heard, and on the board the fluttering urn. And bats went round in fragrant skies, and wheeled or lit the filmy shapes that haunt the dusk, with ermine capes and woolly breasts and beaded eyes, while now we sang old songs that pealed from knoll to knoll, where, couched at ease, the white kine glimmered, and the trees laid their dark arms about the field. But when those others, one by one, withdrew themselves from me and night, and in the house light after light went out, and I was all alone, a hunger seized my heart. I read of that glad year which once had been, and those fallen leaves which kept their green, the noble letters of the dead. And strangely on the silence broke the silent speaking words, and strange was love's dumb cry defying change to test his worth, and strangely spoke the faith, the vigor, bold to dwell on doubt that drive the coward back, and keen through wordy snares to track suggestion to her inmost cell. So word by word and line by line the dead man touched me from the past, and all at once it seemed as last the living soul was flashed on mine. And mine and his was wound, and whirled about imperial heights of thought, and came on that which is, and caught the deep pulsations of the world. Aeonian music measuring out the steps of time, the shocks of chance, the blows of death. At length my trance was cancelled, stricken through with doubt. Vague words, but ah, how hard to frame in matter-moulded forms of speech, or even for intellect to reach through memory that which I became. Till now the doubtful dusk revealed the knolls once more where, couched at ease, the white kine glimmered, and the trees laid their dark arms about the field. And sucked from out the distant gloom a breeze began to tremble o'er the large leaves of the sycamore, and fluctuate all the still perfume. And gathering freshly overhead, rocked the full-foliaged elms, and swung the heavy folded rose, and flung the lilies to and fro, and said, the dawn, and died away, and east and west, without a breath, mixed their dim lights, like life and death, to broaden into boundless day. In this section, Tennyson has a supernatural experience while reading. He's alone on the lawn in the evening after everyone else has gone inside, and is then touched by Helen's soul. This contact is a large part of what allows him to be satisfied with the world in the end. There are a couple of interesting structural notes here, too. First, a couple of lines are repeated, the ones about the kine, which means cows, and the trees. This is a simple but effective way of showing the reader Tennyson's state of mind after meeting Helen. Everything's the same, but it's also different. A breeze comes and everything starts moving, in contrast to the calm at the beginning of the section. Another thing that's notable here is the parallel between the end of this section and the end of section 7, the one with the dark house. Let's compare them. This is the last stanza of section 7. He is not here, but far away the noise of life begins again, and ghastly through the drizzling rain on the bald street breaks the blank day. And this is the end of section 95. The dawn, and died away, and east and west, without a breath, mixed their dim lights, like life and death, to broaden into boundless day. In both cases it's dawn, but in section 7, he is not here, and it's a blank, rainy, ghastly day. In section 95, after Tennyson's Epiphany, Hallam is here again, and the new day is boundless. Time to jump to section 106. Ring out, wild bells, to the wild sky, the flying cloud, the frosty light. The year is dying in the night. Ring out, wild bells, and let him die. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Ring, happy bells, across the snow. The year is going, let him go. Ring out the false, ring in the true. Ring out the grief that saps the mind, for those that here we see no more. Ring out the feud of rich and poor, ring in redress to all mankind. Ring out a slowly dying cause, and ancient forms of party strife. Ring in the nobler modes of life, with sweeter manners, purer laws. Ring out the want, the care, the sin, the faithless coldness of the times. Ring out my mournful rhymes, but bring the fuller minstrel in. Ring out false pride in place and blood, the civic slander and the spite. Ring in the love of truth and right. Ring in the common love of good. Ring out old shapes of foul disease. Ring out the narrowing lust of gold. Ring out the 1,000 wars of old. Ring in the 1,000 years of peace. Ring in the valiant man and free, the larger heart, the kindlier hand. Ring out the darkness of the land. Ring in the Christ that is to be. Oh, true and tried, so well and long, demand thou not a marriage lay, and that it is thy marriage day is music more than any song. This section actually comes just after the third Christmas, but I'm choosing to focus on this instead because it expresses similar sentiments more forcefully. The setting is New Year's Day when bells are rung to celebrate the new year. Tennyson is asking for the rebirth traditionally associated with the new year. This section is very optimistic, especially in a poem that's not, in general. Where earlier in the poem, according to Irene Hsiao, Tennyson was trying to extend the mourning period so that he wouldn't stop caring, now he's asking to ring out the grief that saps the mind and his mournful rhymes and get rid of them. He even says to let him die, although he's referring to the year and not Hallam. In the epilogue, which we won't be reading for time's sake, it's long, Tennyson's sister gets married. Remember, Hallam was engaged to another of Tennyson's sisters before he died. This wedding provides a figurative rebirth for Hallam in the form of Tennyson's new brother-in-law. Tennyson is finally happy. He's accepted Hallam's death and reached a religious and philosophical conclusion. It's a compromise between traditional religion and new scientific ideas, ending with the stanza, that God which ever lives and loves, one God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves. And, now that Tennyson's done, we are too. Now that we've looked at some of what Tennyson wrote, here are a few resources you can use to keep going. First, reading more of Tennyson's work would be a great start. I mentioned earlier that it's not possible to cover In Memoriam properly in a video of this length, and I meant it. There's just too much. If you're tired of that and want something else, these two books, A Poetry Handbook by Mary Oliver and How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry by Edward Hirsch, are great introductions to poetry in general. Oliver gives a great, simple, easy-to-understand explanation of the technical aspects of poetry, and Hirsch focuses more on the emotional and thematic side of things. If you want something more focused, these are the materials I used to construct this video. These provide much deeper insight into a narrower topic, usually a single work or feature of a work. Of course, you can always do research of your own to find more information sources. And finally, here's a little bit about me. I am a freshman at Gordon State College planning to major in computer science. I am also an editor of the Claymore Gordon student newspaper. Thanks for watching.